And we are live, and the recording is in progress. Hello, everyone. Welcome to the NewsWhip Pulse. I'm Paul Quigley, CEO, co-founder at NewsWhip, being joined today by Benedict Nicholson, who's the head of the NewsWhip Research Centre. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks, Paul. Thanks for having me again.
And Ben is an old hand at the Pulse. I highly recommend his webinar, which you can get on the Pulse webpage with Samsung on building frameworks for reputation management, and of course misinformation with University of Michigan and NewsGuard. But today we have something else to talk about, which I'm very much looking forward to getting into. Ben is the lead author of an awesome report we've just published with the modest name of NewsWhip Crisis Q3 2021 report. We're joking a bit about, we think the name undersells it. I certainly do. This is focused on some of the biggest issues brands handled in Q3, with a focus on misinformation, product recalls, worker strikes, vaccine mandates. And these are really some of the highest valence news stories that are going on in the world, and they are very much bringing brands into them and into their wake. And you can see if you're tuned in live, some messages just popping up in the chat from Danielle. She's the show's producer. Feel free to say hi in the chat. And also please feel free to ask any questions, and Danielle will help triage those to us. As always, we're about speed to win side here. We've only got 30 minutes, so let's jump right in, Ben.
Let's do it.
So misinformation, increasingly relevant to brands. And of course, as we know, because we work with both media, NGOs and brands in this space, very hard to define. So what is a misinformation brand crisis today?
That's a great question. And I think it can take a couple of forms. We always talk about, and I think we've talked about this before, Paul, one of the first pulses we actually did was how misinformation has changed since the days of 2016. I don't want to say the Halcyon days, but maybe they were the golden age days of misinformation, where just outright false stories were going viral and all over the internet, and things that were provably, definably false. That's not really what happens anymore, although I do have a fun example of one that is kind of applied, that does kind of apply to. But now it's much more about the gray area of misinformation. So things that may have a basis in truth and that, do have reporting that supports a conclusion, but it's much more a predefined conclusion, and then people share that because it fits their worldview. So in the report, the way we kind of looked at that was by talking about vaccines more broadly. So I'm just going to share my screen very quickly to illustrate this point. Hopefully you can see this okay. This is highly engaged articles about vaccine side effects. And when we talk about misinformation, people think we mean these, dodgy sites with weird URLs. That's not necessarily the case. When we talk about misinformation, a lot of the time these days, it's more audience side and how things are being shared. So you'll note that a lot of these are from, legitimate websites with a storied history of journalism, but the way things are being reported, often it's about an early study that we can't really draw conclusions from yet, but then it's shared by people who have preconceptions about this means that this vaccine is dangerous or whatever it might be. So you see a couple in there. There's one from Newsweek about a child dying after having received the COVID vaccine, even though there was no evidence that there was any causation there, but that gets shared with people who are trying to imply that there is causation, and thus creates this kind of fog of misinformation, almost a fog of war, where you just don't know what to believe, and you kind of hear these vagaries about exactly what's going on, and there's an information overload. And if people that you follow or trust or whatever share that with a nudge and a wink saying what this means, then even though it's reported in a prestigious outlet and there may not be anything wrong with the actual story, it's the context with which the story is shared that can be a problem. And we saw this as maybe contributory to the public health crisis of people not getting vaccinated to a point where we reach herd immunity, especially in America. Because you see these aren't hugely engaged stories in the great scheme of things, but if 60,000 people are engaging with the story and seeing it as evidence that the vaccine has problems or whatever that might be, that's 60,000 people who might not get the vaccine, who then prevent society from moving towards that herd immunity goal. So there's some interesting subplots there about how this can affect public perception, even if the information itself isn't false. The conduits through which it goes can be the problem rather than the information itself. So I think that's something brands really need to be aware of, because there's this thing of like, oh, well, we don't care how this weird website talks about us, but how are you being framed? How are the stories being framed by the conduits of this information? I think is something that's really important to think about.
This feels like a topic where there could be an extended pour yourself a whiskey pulse, because this is complicated stuff, right? We're saying a true fact, for example, about a child dying subsequent to receiving a vaccine, even if true, could form a kind of misinformation if used in the context of a narrative that's false or potentially false. So like we're really getting into tough territory here, right?
Definitely.
Really sliding up the information scale into more difficult territory.
Yeah, and I think it's why brands need to have someone who kind of understands this stuff. And it's crisis, but it's more than that. It's getting in the world of contextual sharing, and it is sometimes outright misinformation, which we'll talk about in a minute. But the thing that understanding how things are shared and how they travel across the social web, I think that's really important to understand as well when it comes to misinformation.
This is kind of real narrative intelligence stuff, isn't it? Like this is why, and we have a lot of communications people who join the Pulse. I'm skeptical of pure misinformation as just a kind of standalone thing. I think it's always interwoven with narratives and with the general work of communications. It's completely inseparable. And those are great examples of that.
Okay. Well, I'm just going to interrupt. There's a question there that I'd like to answer before we move on from Toby. Thanks, Toby, for the question. It's how, when we say framing, what do I mean by that? What's an example? I think that there are a couple of ways. Toby's kind of outlined one there. Of it could be someone sharing with a specific comment. It could also be as simple as someone sharing something with an audience they know is going to take it a certain way. So people build followings and communities around certain things. And if, for example, you have an anti-vax community in some online space, then there's a way where this story getting shared, they immediately read it a certain way, even without necessarily adding context. So it can be the conduit side, or it can even be just the audience side, I think is an important thing to remember.
And there's some good extra questions coming in here, but there's some more straight out, right down the line misinformation examples too, aren't there, Ben? We may come back to the other questions.
Yeah, we'll come back to the questions.
Talk about
those.
Back
to the questions if we can. Yeah. So let me quickly share my screen again. This is the Walmart and Litecoin crisis. So this was very straight misinformation, kind of the opposite end of the spectrum, and more similar to the old things that we used to talk about more often. And this was literally just some people put out a fake Walmart press release saying that they would now be accepting Litecoin, which is a cryptocurrency, at their stores across America. And you can see it fooled a lot of major outlets. And it also fooled the the cryptocurrency markets as well, because Litecoin spiked something like 58% as a result of this. The biggest retailer in America, there were claims that they would start taking it. And you can see that huge jump in public interest there. Early in the day. When I say public interest and media interest here, just for those who aren't aware, public interest is the amount of engagement that the stories that were written is getting, and media interest is literally just the number of stories that were written. So you can see early on there weren't that many stories written, but a huge amount of public interest relatively, as people reacted to the news that appeared in some outlets. And then this, a couple of hours later, is where Walmart had started to correct the record. So they actually were on top of it fairly quickly within a couple of hours, and correcting the record and actually going out to the outlets that were getting the most engagement, interestingly, to correct the record, which is something we've noticed in a crisis. Is if you can correct the record in the places that are getting the most shares, that's probably the best place to start, because you'll get, people will have seen it. And if that story then gets a correction, then more people will see the correction. Which is why it's important to understand how a story is being shared, whether it's completely false like this one, or contextually potentially false like the others.
Very interesting. I wonder if there's almost a category that could emerge of X familiar brand starts accepting N, either to unknown currency or coin, and it's just an attempt to jack the price temporarily by bad actors.
Yeah, and there's so many of these coins now that anything could happen. And Litecoin is not one of the major ones, but definitely one of the category B ones. But there are thousands of these out there that could definitely become a thing. So it's definitely something to watch out for.
It is, and the speed and focusing on the right outlets to correct the record in is really important as well. That's a really good point. So let's move on to another kind of a real perennial crisis category for I think your reports, Ben, which is that of product recalls. We're going to talk today about Johnson & Johnson, Pfizer, and Chevrolet. And don't worry, we're not talking about Pfizer and Johnson & Johnson vaccine recalls.
No, that's good. Good to delineate that before someone quotes us on
it. Before this webinar appears in an anti-vax forum. So does the number, let's see, does the, maybe we could, where would you like to start on the product recalls? Where's the,
I think if we start on the Johnson & Johnson one, I think that's probably the best place to start. Let me just share my screen again so people can see. This is, sorry, trying to share it with people, not present it. This is the Johnson & Johnson one. And this was basically, they recalled 5 sunscreen products. And I think it's interesting to look at the product recalls in kind of a different way to how other information spreads. So the product recalls are often, they start when, especially with the things like sunscreen or food recalls, they start with the FDA and the manufacturer often making a joint statement about the manufacturer agreeing to a product recall. So sometimes you'll even see things start building as early as a day before. And you can see there's one article there on July 13th, just about, you can see. So that's a very early indication into, okay, this is being recalled. And then the media start to pay attention the next day on July 14th. And then the public start to pay attention the following day as things get shared and commented on and just spread around the social web again. And it tends to subside by around day 7, but day 2 and 3 are much bigger. Whereas we've seen in the past, we're not going to show a slide on it here, but things like if a CEO says something bad or does something bad in public, that happens instantly. It's day 1, it's hour 1. Whereas this takes a while to spread as people share it with their peers and so on. I just wanted to contrast that with the Chevy Bolt recall, which had way fewer engagements, but did again go on longer. I think something we've seen is things that anyone might use get a much higher level of engagement. And it's something we've seen across our research generally, that anything that could affect broad communities tends to get a much higher level of engagement because, there's not that many people with a Chevrolet Bolt electric vehicle, right? There's, it's a subset of the population at best. But you think about 6 Johnson & Johnson sunscreens being recalled, you don't know what sunscreens your friends use, what sunscreens your family use. You might not even know what sunscreens Johnson & Johnson makes as a parent company. So you're going to be inclined to share that so that people are aware, especially because if you look at the top stories here, it's all to do with a health risk. So every one of the headlines has either cancer causing or carcinogen or something like that in the headline. And we noticed that the Chevy Bolt, it was much less about the physical danger and more about the cost to the company, which I thought was really interesting, the top articles, and it got way less engagement as a result. So when people think they're doing a public service or a public good by sharing information with their friends, with their family, with their peers, whatever it might be, that tends to be when information goes really, really viral. So that's just something interesting we saw with product recalls. And the effect it has on what level of the population it affects, but then also how that's framed. Is it framed around danger or is it framed around monetary loss?
Was the Pfizer recall, was that also a commonly used product, Ben?
It was Chantix, so an anti-smoking drug, or a drug to wean people off cigarettes. But it was also, again, it was framed around carcinogens, which I think people saw a lot of irony in cancer is obviously a side effect of smoking, and then people were worried about carcinogens in the anti-smoking drugs. So that was a source of irony for people, I think.
I can imagine. There's an interesting parallel. This takes me back to when, in very early days of the kind of, let's call it the social content internet, when people were sharing a lot of content on Facebook, and we started measuring it a long time ago. This is, BuzzFeed emergence period. We saw that if you were to recompose the magazine shelf of the stuff people share, there'd be a huge health section. And a pretty big science section, actually much bigger than you'd ever see in an actual magazine rack, but a huge health section within the science section. I think people just really like passing that forward, whether it's dangers or positive things. And it's a huge category within social content itself, I think.
Yeah, definitely. And I think broader than that, even it's often a local community thing. So local stuff doesn't always go viral, but when it does, it often goes hyper viral. So we saw a couple of years ago, especially when Amber Alerts get put out for missing children and things, those are often the most shared things on Facebook as a whole. There were a couple of quarters where the most shared story was an Amber Alert. And it's even, people outside of the local community sharing it, but it's just people share it just to get the word out and spread the word. So it's very interesting how information spreads when it's a public safety thing, for example, especially in a local community.
I just wanted to, thanks Toby and David for jumping in with the comments and questions there. Let's keep that thread open. If anyone's got anything else on any of the topics, we can kind of we can see the chat here and can jump into some questions as well. Perhaps we're normally pushing it to the end, but it might be fun if anything comes through to put us on the spot.
No, exactly. And I mean, there is another one that I'll get to from Chris about why the Hill gets so many more engagements. It's basically just often it'll be the first to report something, and then people will share that on Facebook, and that will just get out ahead of the rest of things. Sometimes it can just be a particular influencer sharing something as well. So if someone huge on social media shares a particular story, that might become the dominant story. It's the one people see, and then there's a feedback loop, and then that's the one people share. So that's one of the potential reasons for that.
There's a bit of a parallel with stories. There tends to be one dominant with them. And I would note as well, I was looking at the headlines. They were pretty soberly reported headlines, and I was thinking, okay, like this is probably the best you could hope for if you're recalling a sun cream with carcinogenic in it. But I noticed the Hill headline did include cancer causing. Some of the other headlines didn't. They had the name of the chemical, benzene or whatever that was, and perhaps it's just that bit more if it's got cancer causing in it, and the Hill did have that.
Yeah, definitely. Cool. Should we talk about strikes? Strikes is the next fun one.
From one fun topic to another. So from Chevrolet to Frito-Lay,
yes,
and Nabisco, strikes are having a moment. So yeah, can you tell us a bit? Too interesting to see two major food producers strikes over the kind of mid to late summer there. Nabisco and Frito-Lay. So can you tell us a bit about how those played out, Ben?
Yeah, definitely. And it's interesting because Kellogg's is currently going through as well a strike. So it's not just Nabisco and Frito-Lay. So things we thought were interesting about strikes. Obviously, Striketober is in the title of this webinar. I'm going to get to that in a second, but I just want to touch on the strikes that were in the report first. So I'm just going to share my screen again. So this is looking at Newswhip Spike, looking at the Nabisco strike. So you can see here that the strike was announced here, so very early, with not much interest, and then interest begins to pick up the longer people are on the picket line. So about a couple of weeks after the strikes announced, so from between August 10th and August 20th, 21st, that's when interest really picks up. So and the public start to kind of support the strike a lot of the time. You see a lot of the top stories here are really looking at like focusing on the workers' demands, the workers, what the workers want. So the media interest peaks, public interest really peaks. And then what we thought was fascinating about this is nobody really cared when the strike got resolved from the public. The media cared. That got reported a lot. There was reports that it was coming to a conclusion, a deal was about to be reached, but it just didn't resonate with the public once the deal was struck. So you get all the bad press and everything from the initial bad reports, but then you get nothing good from improving conditions. So there is some time to act before the public starts paying attention. So I think that if you can avoid a strike, that's always the best thing. But yeah, you have generally around 2 weeks beforehand. But what we thought was really interesting is basically if Vice interviews one of your workers, that's when things really start to get engagement. And Vice is a funny one because it's probably not on the radar of most C-suite people. I would posit. Not sure if that's necessarily true, but I would guess so. And it's these two stories talking about the strikes from a first-person perspective, from a worker perspective, talking about their complaints, what the working conditions they're being forced to work through. These were the second most engaged story for each of the strikes, with tens of thousands of engagements each. And it's actually even the same reporter, Lauren Curry-Gurley there. One of them was told to her and written as an op-ed kind of through her, and the other one was just reported by her, which I thought was fascinating. Just that's kind of when it's the bad coverage is coming when Vice does a story like that.
There's a few really interesting elements to this. First, if the strike doesn't initially pick up steam and media and public interest, it might after a while. Don't despair if you're the one striking. And then there will be a wall of coverage, but the public, it seemed like it was a wave in both cases. And what drove the most engagement was these narratives. We actually focus on the experience of the people striking. And I work 12-hour days making your chips and it sucks. And here's why. And that's a really powerful social story. So call in Vice on day 7.
Yeah, that's right. And I think maybe it makes sense to look at other strikes now, Paul, just while we're on the topic. So I also built this dashboard comparing other things. So looking at strikes in the context of other strikes that are happening right now. So 2 of the major ones that are happening are Kellogg's and the John Deere strike. And then the purple line here is just all strike coverage in English language across North America. So you can see early on, attention about strikes was really being dominated by the Kellogg strike. And then kind of the middle of October, the John Deere strike happened. And you can see, that then drove the majority of the coverage, but even Kellogg's didn't go away. So that's still ongoing, as is the John Deere strike. And they achieve very similar levels of peak engagement right around when the strike started. Again, we can click into the John Deere strike. It's going to take a second to load, so apologies, but I can talk over it while it does. The strike was announced on October 1st, and it took until October kind of 14th for people. So you can see here, this story here, this is when the John Deere workers rejected the contract and said that they were planning to strike because there was no other way forward for them. But then October 14th is when the strike began, and that's when people really began paying attention. Washington Post, another leader, you can see the Facebook pages that have shared it, Robert Reich, etc. The other 98%, the kind of the usual suspects with this stuff. So yeah, I just thought that was really interesting. Another example of kind of you having 2 weeks between it being announced and the actual things happening and people paying attention. So yeah, just thought that was worth pointing out and looking into.
It's a fascinating pattern. I wouldn't have predicted that. Really interesting pattern. So we have one more topic, which is, some people here may have heard of something called the vaccine and something called the vaccine mandate. So we're going to focus in here on 3 brands, I suppose, that have been top of the discussion here: United, Delta, and the NBA, and airlines have been particularly under scrutiny and flashpoints for this, right, Ben?
Yeah, definitely. So you can see a comparison here of United and Delta. United announced their vaccine mandate towards the beginning of last month, whereas Delta, it's not actually a vaccine mandate, that it's more encouragement through raising people's health insurance premiums. But United came out and said that they would be announcing this mandate, and Delta actively said, we're not doing that yet. And then you can see actually when they did do it, it got way more attention. It actually got more criticism because people thought it was to raise people's health insurance premiums was the wrong way to go about doing it. We've also seen, both of these had a much better time of it than Southwest did, who were the last major, or one of the later major airlines to do it within the US. And they ran into significant problems because of the timing of it. Came right around the time of both a statement from the pilots union saying that they didn't think that a vaccine mandate was a good thing, and also some bad weather in the US that caused Southwest to cancel a bunch of flights. And then again, we can see, going back to the misinformation side of things, that got spun as a narrative because of that combination of two things. It became a narrative that the pilots were on strike, basically, or were calling in sick because they didn't want to comply with the vaccine mandate or whatever. And that kind of, especially in conservative media, that ran away from the truth, which Southwest put out, at least, or that Southwest statement, which was that there weren't enough air traffic controllers and the weather was grounding planes, and they have a different model to the usual hub and spoke model of the big airlines in the US. So that's again shows how narratives can kind of run away from you. And I'm conscious of time, so I'll move straight on to the NBA. The NBA has had some outspoken critics of the vaccine, notably Kyrie Irving, who plays for one of the New York teams. And people may be aware that there was a big protest outside the Barclays Center the other day, looking and even almost a storming of the gates as people protested the vaccine. But we saw early signs of this and kind of people stoking up that support for Kyrie Irving, especially again in conservative media, which have tended to be anti-vaccine mandate. So you kind of could have got a preview of that had you been looking in the right places. So this is all from the end of September, like way before anything actually tangible happened. But if you're on the lookout for crisis, it's good to look at the things that are bubbling up, even if it's not from your traditional audience. You might say you don't care about an article in the Blaze or whatever because it's a conservative publication. That's not your audience. But if it's going to inspire people to act against your brand in some way, then it's worth paying attention to, I would say. That's all I wanted to highlight with this.
That's good. So, that is one thing, as many people on the line may be advising companies that are doing some forms of vaccine mandates, and they should be paying attention to a much wider spectrum of media and influencers, and potentially the full kind of social ecosystem as well, for the criticism that may come in. I want to point to everyone who is here that Danielle's just dropped a link to the Q3 2021 crisis report, and we're going into more detail on a lot of these matters there, and you can kind of get a little bit more if any of those are of particular interest. And we have just a little bit of time. Is there any questions that you can see coming through, Ben?
Haven't seen any new ones, so I guess that's that on.
We might finish on time. Well, let's invite certainly everyone who's been able to make it today. We're going to be continuing regular reports and focuses on crisis. It's very easy to find me and Ben. If you see any things that you'd like us to do a deep dive on in the next crisis report, we'd love to know about it. And we'll make sure that we do some research, because we love to, we're very grateful to the audience here, and we love being inspired by which topics you'd like to be digging into yourselves. So link is in the chat. You can also find the report on our website. And when are we going to be back next, Ben? It's in November.
Yep, end of November. Still to be announced the next guest. We'll keep it a surprise for now, but yeah, we'll be back at the end of November. And in the meantime, I would say we just published our Facebook publishing report as well for Q4, so for Q3 rather. So if you're interested in that, the top content on Facebook, both web publishers and native content, then that is also on our website and fresh off the presses. So
brilliant, get it now.
Cool.
Fresh off the presses, all the most recent data.
That's
Thanks very much for joining, everyone. Thanks for questions, and we will see you next month. Thank you, Ben.
Thanks, Paul. Bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.